July 12, 1943, 14:20 hours. Road intersection 3 kilometers north of Gela, Sicily. Corporal Marco Benedetti stood at the roadside checkpoint, hands raised, watching the column of British Sherman tanks rumble toward his position. Around him, 12 other Italian soldiers maintained surrender postures, rifles stacked, white cloth tied to a pole, the universal signal that they'd stopped fighting. The July Sicilian heat made his uniform stick to his back, sweat running down his face, but Marco barely noticed the discomfort. He was too busy deciding whether to commit treason. In his tunic pocket, folded carefully, was a hand-drawn map showing every minefield his unit had laid across the road network, leading inland from the beaches. Defensive positions marked precisely. Safe routes indicated. Areas where British tanks could advance without triggering the hundreds of German Teller mines and Italian anti-tank devices that waited beneath the dusty Sicilian earth. The map represented months of defensive preparation. It was military intelligence of the highest value. Possessing it during surrender was probably punishable by execution under Italian military law. Giving it to the enemy was definitely treason. But Marco had made his decision 3 days ago, when he'd watched German officers shoot 2 Italian soldiers who'd suggested withdrawing, rather than defending a hopeless position. When he'd seen what fascism and its German allies had brought to Italy. When he'd realized that continuing this war meant more Italian boys dying for a cause already lost. The lead Sherman tank stopped 30 meters away, turret traversing to cover the surrendering Italians. The hatch opened and a British tank commander emerged. Lieutenant James Crawford of the Royal Tank Regiment, though Marco didn't know his name yet. Crawford studied the Italians through binoculars, assessing whether this was genuine surrender or an ambush. Marco made the decision that would haunt and vindicate him for the rest of his life. He reached slowly into his pocket, ensuring no sudden movements would be misinterpreted as reaching for a weapon. His fingers found the folded map. He held it up, clearly visible, and called out in broken English he'd learned from tourists before the war. Map. Important. Mines. Crawford's binoculars focused on the paper Marco held. The British officer's posture changed from cautious to intensely interested. He spoke rapidly to his radio operator, then climbed down from the tank, service revolver drawn but pointed down, approaching with 2 infantrymen covering him. Marco waited, hand still raised holding the map, knowing that in the next few minutes he'd either save lives or face a firing squad, possibly both. But he'd made his choice. Italy's war was over, even if Italy didn't know it yet. And if giving this map to the British meant fewer men, Italian, British, German, whoever died in the pointless defense of an island that Mussolini had already lost, then Marco would accept whatever consequences came. Crawford stopped 5 meters away. You speak English? Little. Marco replied carefully. I have map. Show mines. German mines. Italian mines. All mines. He gestured to the road ahead. You go there. Boom. Many boom. I show safe way. Crawford's eyes narrowed. This could be a trap, a false map leading British armor directly into killing zones, or it could be legitimate intelligence from a demoralized Italian, who'd realized their cause was lost. Why? Crawford asked simply. Why help us? Marco's response was quiet but carried weight that transcended language barriers. Enough dying, enough war. I soldier not murderer. You follow map. Maybe you no die. Maybe my friends no die fighting you. Maybe war end faster, less people dead. Is good. Yes. Crawford studied Marco's face for a long moment, then he holstered his pistol, and reached for the map. What happened next would determine whether dozens of British tanks advanced safely, or drove into minefields that would kill their crews. Whether Italy's slow collapse into civil war and German occupation was marginally less bloody than it might have been. Whether one Italian corporal's act of conscience mattered in a war that had already killed millions. Crawford unfolded the map and began to study it carefully, while Marco Benedetti waited to discover if he'd committed the most honorable treason of his life, or simply treason. Marco's decision hadn't been sudden. It had been building for 2 years since Italy's entry into the war had transformed from triumphant alliance with Germany into grinding catastrophe. He joined the Italian army in 1940, like hundreds of thousands of young Italians, believing Mussolini's promises about restoring Roman glory and building an empire. The propaganda had been seductive. Italy would take its rightful place among great powers. Mediterranean would become Mare Nostrum again. Fascism would prove its superiority over decadent democracies. Reality had been different. Greece had defeated Italy's invasion, requiring German rescue that subordinated Italian military operations to German command. North Africa had become graveyard for Italian divisions, poorly equipped and badly led, sacrificed in hopeless offensives. The Soviet Union had consumed the Italian Eighth Army, frozen and starved and destroyed. By 1943, Italy's military was collapsing, its economy failing, its people starving, and Mussolini was puppet dancing to Hitler's orders. Marco had watched Italian boys, some as young as 16, conscripted despite regulations, sent into combat with inadequate weapons, insufficient ammunition, and orders from German officers who treated them as disposable auxiliaries rather than allies. He'd seen wounded Italians left behind during German withdrawals because Wehrmacht vehicles had no room for inferior troops. He'd watched German officers execute Italian soldiers for cowardice that was actually reasonable tactical retreat from impossible situations. The specific moment that crystallized Marco's decision had come on July 9, the day Allied forces invaded Sicily. His unit, a mixed Italian-German defensive company, held positions overlooking the beaches near Gela. They'd watched the invasion fleet arrive, hundreds of ships, overwhelming air cover, endless resources that made Italian resistance look pathetic. The German major commanding their sector had ordered them to hold the position to the last man, standard fanatic rhetoric about fighting to the death. Private Giuseppe Cardelli, a 19-year-old from Naples, had quietly suggested to his sergeant that withdrawing to better defensive positions inland made more tactical sense than dying on the beaches. The sergeant had reported this to the German major, either from ideological loyalty or fear of being accused of defeatism himself. The major had ordered Cardelli, and another private who'd agreed with him, taken behind the command post. Marco had heard the shots. 2 Italian boys executed by their German ally, for the crime of tactical common sense. That night, while German troops slept and Italian soldiers whispered fearfully about what had happened, Marco had made his decision. This war was over. Italy had lost. Continuing to fight meant more Italian boys dying for nothing, either killed by allies who were winning, or executed by Germans who treated Italians as expendable. If he could do anything to reduce the death toll, he would do it, even if it meant treason, even if it meant dishonor in the eyes of fascist loyalists, even if it meant his own execution. The map had been relatively easy to create. As corporal, he'd been responsible for helping lay defensive positions. He knew where the minefields were because he'd helped dig them. He'd carefully memorized patterns, which roads were clear, which had mines, where safe routes existed. Over 3 nights, working by candlelight in concealment, he'd drawn the map, marking everything he remembered with obsessive detail. He planned to surrender with the map hidden in his boot, but circumstances had overtaken planning. Allied advance had been faster than German command expected. Marco's unit had been cut off from retreat routes. Surrender had become the only option. So when British tanks appeared, Marco had made his choice public. He'd revealed the map. He'd called out in English. He'd committed himself to course of action that couldn't be reversed. Now he stood waiting to discover whether his act of conscience would matter, or whether he'd simply betrayed his country for nothing. The verification Lieutenant Crawford studied the map with intense focus, comparing it against his own military maps of the area. The detail was extraordinary. Minefield patterns marked precisely, safe routes indicated clearly, defensive positions annotated with notes about which were Italian-held versus German-held. But was it real, or elaborate deception designed to lead British armor into traps? Crawford called forward his engineering officer, Captain William Hughes, who'd trained in mine clearance and defensive analysis. Hughes examined Marco's map carefully, asking questions through an Italian-speaking British soldier, who'd been brought forward from the infantry. Ask him how he knows these mine locations. Marco explained through the translator. I help lay them. My unit, we work 3 weeks making defenses. German engineers show us patterns. We dig, we place mines, we cover. I remember everything. Why are these routes marked in red? safe paths, for our vehicles, for resupply. We need ways through our own minefields. Red is safe, black is mines, blue is maybe mines. Areas we think Germans put additional mines without telling us. Hughes studied the map's detail, cross-referencing with intelligence reports about Italian defensive doctrine. The patterns matched what British engineers expected from combined German-Italian mine-laying, German precision in placement, Italian documentation, systematic safe routes for defenders' use. This looks genuine, Hughes said to Crawford. The mine patterns match German doctrine. These safe routes make tactical sense, positioned for defender resupply and retreat. If this is deception, it's extraordinarily sophisticated. Crawford made the difficult command decision. We'll test it. Advance down this marked safe route slowly, engineers probing ahead. If we hit mines, we stop immediately, and assume the map is false. If we clear 3 kilometers without incident, we'll trust it. He turned to Marco, still standing with hands raised, sweating in Sicilian heat, waiting to learn if his treason would save lives or kill them. If this map is false, Crawford said through the translator, if British soldiers die, because of your information, you will be shot. Do you understand? Marco nodded slowly. I understand. Map is true. I promise on my mother. Map is true. I no want more dying. British, Italian, German, no matter. Enough people dead already. Why should I believe you? Marco's response was simple, direct, and carried moral weight that transcended sides in the war. Because I soldier, not murderer. Because this war is finished. Italy is finished. Mussolini is finished. Because if I lie, British die, but also my friends die when you attack angry. If I tell truth, maybe less people die, maybe war end faster, is right thing. Crawford studied Marco's face for a long moment, then he made his decision. We'll test your map. If it's accurate, you and your men will be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Conventions. If it's false, he didn't finish the threat. It was unnecessary. Marco simply nodded. He'd done what he could. Now the truth of his map would speak for itself. The British column, advanced slowly along the route Marco's map indicated was safe. Combat engineers walked ahead, probing the ground with mine detectors, clearing suspicious areas, verifying that the map's promised safety was real. First kilometer, no mines encountered. Engineers confirmed the route was clear. Second kilometer, edges of marked minefield visible from safe route. Engineers investigated, found exactly the mine patterns Marco's map showed, positioned precisely where he'd indicated. Third kilometer, junction where map showed safe left turn, avoiding major minefield to right. Engineers probed right, found dense mine concentration exactly as mapped. Probed left, found clear route continuing safely inland. Crawford, watching from his tank commander's position, felt tension releasing. The map was genuine. Marco had given them real intelligence, potentially saving dozens of tanks and their crews from mines that would have killed them. Bring the Italian corporal forward, Crawford ordered. Marco was brought up to Crawford's tank under guard. Crawford climbed down, facing the Italian soldier, who'd committed treason to save lives. Your map is accurate, Crawford said through the translator. You've given us valuable intelligence that will save British lives. Why did you do this? Marco's response was tired, but carried conviction. I tell you already, enough dying. Italy's war is over. We lose. Everybody knows we lose, except Mussolini and his fascist friends. Why more Italian boys die for lost war? Why British boys die on mines when I can show safe way? War ends faster, less people die. Is simple. Crawford studied him. You realize you've committed treason against Italy. I commit treason against Mussolini, Marco corrected carefully. Not against Italy. Italy would be better without this war, without fascism, without Germans treating us like slaves. I help war end faster. I help Italy. It was rationalization perhaps, but it was also truth. Italy's fascist government was leading the country to destruction. Italians were dying by the thousands for German strategic goals. Mussolini's regime had brought Italy to ruin. If helping end the war faster was treason, Marco accepted the label. History would judge whether he'd been traitor or patriot. Right now he'd simply done what seemed right, saved lives when he could, however he could. The consequences Marco and his men were processed as prisoners of war, sent to Allied POTAL camps in North Africa. They received adequate food, medical care, and treatment according to Geneva Conventions, significantly better conditions than many Italian soldiers experienced under German command. But Marco's story had larger consequences beyond his personal fate. Word spread among Italian units that surrendering to British or American forces meant decent treatment, adequate rations, and safety from German reprisals. The psychological impact was significant. Italian soldiers increasingly viewed Allied forces not as enemies but as liberators from both fascism and German occupation. The map Marco provided helped British forces advance inland faster, encountering fewer casualties from mines, reaching objectives ahead of schedule. This contributed to Sicily's rapid fall. The campaign ended in 38 days rather than the months German command had hoped to delay Allied victory. Sicily, quote, S fall triggered Italy's political collapse. Mussolini was deposed on July 25, just 2 weeks after Marco surrendered. Italy signed armistice with allies on September 8. German forces occupied Italy, beginning the brutal Civil War period, when Italians fought Germans who'd been their allies, while Marco sat in POW camp, watching his country tear itself apart. But the immediate tactical impact of Marco's map was undeniable. British after-action reports noted, Italian POU provided detailed minefield map that proved accurate, saving estimated 12-15 tanks and 50-60 personnel from mine casualties. Information significantly facilitated advance inland from beaches, 12 to 15 tanks, 50 to 60 men, not large numbers in a war that killed millions, but to those 50 to 60 men, who didn't die because Marco gave British forces his map, it was everything. To their families who welcomed them home after war's end rather than receiving death notifications, it mattered absolutely. To the Italian soldiers in Marco's unit, who weren't killed in hopeless last stands against overwhelming force, who survived to see Italy freed from fascism, the decision to surrender rather than die pointlessly was vindication. The British perspective of Lieutenant Crawford, writing in his personal diary, discovered by his family decades later and donated to Imperial War Museum, reflected on the incident. July 12, 1943. Italian corporal gave us complete map of defensive minefields. Extraordinary act. He knew it was treason, knew he faced execution. If his side discovered it, did it anyway, because he believed continuing the war was worse than betraying fascist government. Quote, the shot at Italians, watched them surrender, in masses, considered them poor soldiers fighting badly for bad cause. But this corporal showed courage I'm not certain I'd have matched. He chose conscience over country, or rather, chose his country's true welfare over government's false pride. The map saved lives, British lives primarily, but also Italian lives because faster advance means less fighting, fewer casualties both sides. Did he betray Italy, or did he serve Italy better than Mussolini ever did? Crawford's question captured the moral complexity. Was Marco traitor or patriot? The answer depended on how one defined Italy, the fascist state, or the Italian people. For British forces advancing through Sicily, the question was simpler. Marco had helped them. They treated him and his men fairly, as soldiers who'd surrendered honorably, rather than criminals who'd betrayed their side. Captain Hughes, the engineer who'd verified Marco's map, encountered Marco 3 days later, in the POU processing camp. He approached the Italian corporal, who stood nervously, unsure what British officer wanted. Through translator, Hughes said simply, your map was accurate. You saved British lives. Thank you. Marco's response was quiet. I hope I saved Italian lives too. Less fighting, less dying. You did, Hughes confirmed. Faster advance means less resistance, fewer casualties both sides. You helped end this campaign faster. That saved lives all around. Marco nodded, accepting validation that his treason had been right action, even if wrong legally. Sometimes doing the moral thing required betraying the legal thing. Sometimes conscience demanded choices that courts-martial would condemn. Deed made his choice. He'd live with consequences, but he wouldn't regret saving lives, whichever uniform those lives wore. The German Raktionem intelligence eventually learned about Italian soldiers providing defensive information to Allied forces. The response was predictable and brutal.
German High Command issued orders that Italian soldiers suspected of collaboration with Allies were to be executed immediately without trial. German troops, occupying Italy after the September armistice, treated Italian soldiers with savage cruelty, disarming them, imprisoning them, often executing them on pretexts. The Cephalonia massacre, in September 1943, when German forces executed over 5,000 Italian soldiers who'd refused to surrender to Germans after Italy's armistice, was the largest but not the only such incident. Throughout Italy, German forces killed Italian soldiers they believed had betrayed Axis by helping Allies or refusing to continue fighting. Marco, safely in Allied Palau camp, when these reprisals occurred, heard the news through underground prison communication networks. He learned that several of his former comrades, who'd remained in German-controlled units, had been executed when they'd attempted to surrender to Allied forces after Italy's armistice. The knowledge was devastating. Men he'd served with died for choosing the same path he'd chosen, ending hopeless war, refusing to die for failed cause. But they'd made their choice too late, after Germans controlled their fate, rather than before. Marco had been lucky, or prescient, in surrendering when he did, before Germans could prevent it. That luck felt like guilt. He'd survived. Others hadn't, but he couldn't regret the choice itself. The war had been wrong. Fascism had been wrong. Continuing to fight would have been wrong. He'd chosen conscience over orders, humanity over ideology, life over death. If that was treason, he accepted the label. Better to be traitor to evil cause than loyal soldier for wrong side. After the war, Marco remained in Allied Palau camps until 1945. He was repatriated to Italy in spring 1946, returning to a country devastated by civil war, German occupation, and Allied liberation fighting. His family's village in Tuscany had been fought over 3 times, by Germans retreating north, by Allied forces advancing, by partisan fighters clearing remaining fascists. His family home was damaged but standing. His parents had survived, though his younger brother had been killed by German reprisal action after partisan attack. Marco, Seth's reception in his village was mixed. Some saw him as traitor, who'd betrayed Italy by helping the enemy. Others saw him as sensible man, who'd recognized lost cause and stopped contributing to pointless deaths. Most simply saw him as survivor, who'd done what he thought necessary and came home alive. He never denied giving the map to British. When asked why, his response was always the same. The war was lost. More dying wouldn't change that. I saved lives, British lives, Italian lives. If that's treason, I'm guilty, but I'd do it again. He worked as farmer for the rest of his life, married, raised 4 children, lived quietly. He never joined political parties, never spoke publicly about the war beyond his village, never sought recognition or justification. But in 1985, 42 years after the incident, he received an unexpected letter from Britain. James Crawford, Lieutenant Crawford, who'd accepted Marco's map in 1943, had died. His family, going through his effects, had found his diary describing Marco's action. They'd tracked Marco down through military records and written to him. Crawford's diary entry, quoted in their letter, included his reflection. The Italian corporal's courage haunts me. He betrayed his government to serve his country's true interests. He risked execution to save lives. He chose morality over legality. I hope he survived the war. I hope Italy recognizes what he did as patriotism, not treason. The letter continued. Our father never forgot what you did. He believed you saved British lives through your courage. He wanted you to know that he considered you an honorable man who made a difficult moral choice. He hoped you lived well and without regret. Marco, reading the letter at age 65, wept. For 42 years he'd wondered if his action had mattered, if the lives saved justified the treason committed. Crawford's words, even arriving decades late, through family after Crawford's death, provided the validation Marco hadn't known he needed. He wrote back to Crawford's family, "Your father treated me with respect when I was enemy soldier and prisoner. He understood. I did what I thought was right. Thank you for telling me he remembered. I am old man now, but knowing he believed I did right thing means very much." The Crossing, Sicily, 2003. Marco Benedetti died at age 82, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew his story, but never quite understood the weight of the choice he'd made 60 years earlier. At his funeral, his oldest son read from his father's simple memoir, just a few pages Marco had written near the end of his life, explaining his wartime decision. I gave the British a map showing our mines, because I believed the war was already lost, and more fighting meant more dying for nothing. I didn't want British boys dying on mines I helped lay. I didn't want Italian boys dying defending positions we couldn't hold. I wanted the war to end faster, so everyone could go home. Some people called me traitor. Maybe I was, but I was traitor to fascism, not to Italy. Mussolini's war destroyed my country. Helping end it faster was the most patriotic thing I could do. The British officer who took my map treated me with respect. His men treated my soldiers fairly. We were prisoners, yes, but we were alive and safe, which was more than many Italian soldiers could say under German command. I never regretted giving them that map. 50 or 60 British soldiers didn't die because of what I did. That's 50 or 60 men who went home to their families. That's right, action, whatever military law said. I learned that sometimes the right thing looks like betrayal. Sometimes conscience demands you violate orders. Sometimes serving your country means opposing your government. I was 23 years old standing at that roadside with the map in my pocket, deciding whether to be loyal soldier or traitor who saved lives. I chose saving lives. I'd make the same choice again. The words echoed in the small Tuscan church. Marco's family sat silently, understanding perhaps for the first time the courage their father had shown. Not battlefield courage of fighting against odds, but moral courage of choosing conscience over duty. Humanity over ideology, lives over loyalty. The roadside in Sicily where Marco had raised the map and called out mines, in broken English, looked no different now than in 1943. Tourists drove past without knowing that 60 years earlier, a young Italian corporal had committed honorable treason there, betraying his government to serve a higher cause, reducing the death toll of a war already lost. The map itself was gone, lost in British military archives or destroyed in routine document disposal. But its impact remained in the British tank crews who'd advanced safely past minefields that would have killed them, in the Italian soldiers who'd surrendered rather than die uselessly, in the faster Allied advance that shortened Sicily's campaign and hastened Italy's liberation from fascism. One map, one moment of moral courage, one corporal who decided that saving lives mattered more than following orders. The calculations were simple in retrospect. If giving the enemy a map meant fewer deaths on both sides, then giving the map was right action regardless of what military law said about treason. But in that moment, standing at Sicilian roadside with British tanks approaching and map folded in his pocket, the choice had required extraordinary courage. Marco could have destroyed the map, surrendered quietly, followed military law. He chose instead to violate every rule about aiding the enemy, because those rules served a government and cause he'd stopped believing in. But Lieutenant Crawford had been right in his diary entry. Marco's action was patriotism, not treason. He'd served Italy's true interests, peace, liberation from fascism, reduced casualties, faster end to losing war, by betraying Italy's fascist government. Sometimes the most patriotic act is the one that looks most like treason. Marco Benedetti understood the truth at age 23, standing in Sicilian heat with sweaty uniform and a map that could save lives or end his own. He made his choice. He never regretted it. The map is lost, but the lesson remains. Conscience sometimes demands choices that courts would condemn. Morality sometimes requires violating legality. Saving lives sometimes means betraying orders. Marco chose conscience. He chose morality. He chose life. 60 years later, dying peacefully in his Tuscan village, he closed his eyes knowing he'd made the right choice. The British tank crews who'd advanced safely through minefields his map revealed had lived full lives, raised families, grown old. The Italian soldiers who'd surrendered with him had survived rather than died in pointless last stands. One map, dozens of lives saved. One moment when a young corporal decided that enough dying mattered more than loyalty to a losing cause. The last words in Marco's memoir were simple. I was soldier, but I was human first. That's what mattered. That's what always matters. The church bell tolled. The funeral ended. Marco Benedetti was buried in Tuscan earth, far from the Sicilian roadside where he'd committed his honorable treason. But his choice echoed forward. A reminder that sometimes the most moral action looks like the most immoral one, that serving humanity sometimes means betraying authority, and that one person's courage to choose conscience over orders can save lives that would otherwise be lost to ideological stubbornness. The map saved lives. The man who gave it away saved more than that. He saved the principle that human conscience matters more than military law, that reducing suffering matters more than following orders, and that sometimes treason is the most patriotic act possible. Marco Benedetti, traitor to fascism, servant of humanity, soldier who chose life over death when the choice was his to make.